Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Let's Talk About It podcast by по-Британски. I'm your host, Ivan, and this time I'm going to tell you a brief history of astrology, starting from prehistory and up to the modern days. But why astrology, you might ask? Well, just because I have been watching the show called Натальная карта and got really interested in astrology itself. And the first thing I started thinking about is, how can it be possible that on one hand so many people believe in something and on the other hand the same number of people say that it's all porkies? To find out the answer to this question, we're going to dive into the history of this worldwide known phenomenon called astrology. But before we start, I have to say that I'm not a believer of something, as well as I'm not against it. So I should mention that I'm not going to give you my opinion on whether you should believe in it or not. It's your life, and only you know what's best for you, so it's all up to you. Moreover, remember that you can always find the script and word set for this episode on my Boosty at boosty.to/Britishly. You can find all the useful links in the description of this episode. So, are you ready to learn more about astrology? Let's talk about it. That might be amazing, but early humans were tracking lunar cycles as long ago as 4000 BC. We know this fact from animal bones marked with lines and patterns to track the movement of the moon and sun. We also know that our early ancestors would have needed a working knowledge of the path of the seasons so that they could plant and harvest. Moreover, it was a common thing to worship the sun and moon in the prehistory time. People did that in order to let the moon and sun know that they appreciated their power. Our next stop is Mesopotamia, and if it doesn't ring any bells for you, well, it's the area in the West Asia nowadays known as Iraq. At that time, there were people known as Sumerians, who had a profound understanding of mathematics and astronomy. They used this knowledge in many spheres of their life, interpreting signs that the sky showed them. By around 750 BC, Babylonian astronomers and astrologers had divided the sky into 18 zodiac signs, creating the horoscope circle diagram we still recognize today. They had also developed a system so that they could accurately predict future planetary movements. They later removed 6 signs from the zodiac, so that there were only 12 signs left in around 600 BC. The ancient Greeks further developed Babylonian ideas of astrology and astronomy, with both Pythagoras and Plato working on the idea that humans portrayed the universe in pictures. Moreover, the ancient Greeks introduced the 4 astrological elements such as fire, earth, air, and water. In classical Greece, astrology was closely linked to medicine and healing, so the 4 elements were used to diagnose and treat illnesses. Also, you may know the next fact, but the modern names of the planets and zodiac signs come to us from Greek mythology. Furthermore, I just have to mention Claudius Ptolemy, who was the most famous of all the early astrologers. His astrological text Tetrabiblos was widely used in the 17th century and laid down the foundations of astrology we still recognize today. Moving forward, I would like to ask you a question. Have you ever thought who was the first to introduce the 365-day calendar that we still use? The answer is the ancient Egyptians. Not only did they bring the idea of a year consisting of 365 days, but they also divided a year into 12 months. And do you think that's all? No. Thereafter, they assigned the zodiac signs to the months and seasons. All this was made after around 300 BC, when the Egyptians adopted the classical Greek astrological system. Later in the history, many important astrological ideas flowed from ancient Greece to ancient Rome. Nevertheless, it would be rather foolish to say that those ideas were perfectly accepted and applied there in Rome. That was because the Romans were rather skeptical and sometimes even paranoid about the whole subject of astrology. Can you believe it? But they really thought that astrological charts had magical power that could be used in a bad way, if it was only for the folk who didn't trust astrology. But no, even some of the emperors not only were skeptical about it, but feared it. They reckoned that this magical power could have been used in the field of politics to, for instance, depose their emperor. An excellent example of this kind of emperor was Augustus, who in 11 AD attempted to crack down on astrology and even exiled and executed some astrologers. However, his ancestor Tiberius had the completely opposite view on this matter. He even had his own court astrologer to try and predict who had the potential to betray the emperor and to depose him. After that, he just got rid of those people, and that's it. Getting off the subject a bit, do you remember that I told you that I like watching Натальная карта? I hope you do, because Натальная карта in English is birth chart. But why am I bringing this idea at this stage of affairs? Well, because at the time around the 11 AD, there had already been introduced the birth chart. Thus, the Emperor Nero considered it treason for anyone to see his birth chart, and the person who'd done it would get executed without any mercy. Now, let's move a bit forward and up to the medieval and Renaissance eras, which took place between the 11th and 17th centuries. At that time, astrology saw a great rise of interest. First sphere which adopted astrology was astronomy, and now every astronomer was also an astrologer. Astrology itself wasn't a questionable subject anymore. At that time, it was even taught in literature. And how do you like the following facts? Every human being who had a desire to advance in the sphere of medicine and qualify as a doctor had to qualify as an astrologer first. You might pose a question here, why is that? Well, because for instance, bloodletting was done according to moon phases and signs, and other treatments were advised or forbidden according to the current planetary positions and movements. Moreover, all the people who had power had personal astrologers. Here I'm not talking only about folk, but about kings, popes, and other nobles. Those astrologers helped to make important decisions, such as whether to marry a person or even to start a war. It was in the 17th century when the famous astronomer William Lilly predicted the Great Fire of London. Can you believe it? 14 years before the event. Unfortunately for astrology, thereafter came the Industrial Revolution, and people started to focus on scientific discoveries more and more, whilst the interest to astrology was fading in this new rapidly changing world. But not only the Industrial Revolution itself was the reason why astrology fell out of favor. The Catholic Church also had a huge impact on it, with people believing in God, not in some planetary movements. As a result of these factors, astrology and astronomy parted ways for good in the 17th century. Now, with the coming of new discoveries in the field of astronomy and all the emphasis being put on science, people started considering astrology the black sheep. Moving on, in the 19th century came the era of rationalism, which was the key philosophical theory at that time. So now astrology was widely laughed at, and those who practiced it did it in complete secrecy. With the coming of the 20th century, there appeared a very well-known figure who was responsible for the creation of the Astrological Lodge of London in 1917. His name is Alan Lear. Due to this, in the following few decades, the popularity of astrology only rose with people of power paying close attention to the subject. Astrology wasn't the object of mockery anymore, as well as it wasn't used as a predicative tool. Now it was used in psychological and counseling ways. An immense impact was made by R.H. Naylor, who created a horoscope, the so-called birth chart, for Princess Margaret after her birth in 1930. This whole thing aroused so much interest that he was asked to write a regular column in one of the British newspapers. He also was asked to simplify astrology so that every reader could understand how it works and how to use it. This led to the creation of Sun Sign Horoscope, which proved to be very popular. The next important step towards popularity and worldwide recognition was made in 1955 by French psychologist Michael Gocklin. He made a research into astrology and discovered that there was a correlation between sporting skills and the position of Mars in the birth chart. This was a controversial but still a remarkable discovery which laid the foundations for the future trials to prove astrology. Thereafter, thereafter, there appeared a lot of newspaper horoscopes and TV programs telling about differing esoteric stuff. So already fast-growing interest to the subject of astrology got a second wind and continued to grow with a new speed. So nowadays, it's a rare occasion to meet a person who doesn't know anything about astrology, or, for example, cannot tell you their zodiac sign. The most important fact here is that even those who don't believe in astrology and everything related to the subject do know their zodiac signs. And this, as you can see, is the greatest example of the popularity that astrology has. Nevertheless, it has a rather peculiar position in society. I mean, it is hugely popular with general public, but still openly laughed at in the scientific community. Moreover, it is known that some politicians, presidents, and high-profile banking and financial leaders have consulted with astrologers. Most of them still depend on this subject. Nonetheless, they prefer to deny any connections to it. An interesting fact here is that modern astrologers cannot explain the mechanism behind astrology. In other words, they cannot tell how exactly it works. Maybe that's the reason why now astrology is mostly viewed as a psychological tool of self-understanding rather than a subject of science. Bringing an end to this episode, I just want to tell you that now we're living in hard and unpredictable times. We are all human beings, and we always want and need just a little bit of understanding of the future. We all want to live happily and see where we're going. Sometimes we have our personal problems that we cannot solve easily. At those times, we look at the sky and search the so needed answers there among the stars and endless darkness. So, that's it. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you have, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, because there are more fascinating and incredible episodes to come. Moreover, remember that if you have trouble understanding this episode, go on my Boosty at boosty.to/Britishly, and you'll find the script and word set for this episode at a fair price. You can find all the links in the description to this episode. And the last but not the least, if you have trouble learning English, or you are feeling stuck not knowing what to do to develop your knowledge, then you can always write me on Angliski po-Brитански on VK and ask for help. My brave teachers and I are always glad to see new faces joining the courses. Thank you for listening. My name's been Ivan. Stay tuned. Ta-da!